When we talk about Westeros, I think it's important to keep in mind that even though it's called a kingdom, it's really an empire. And in political science terms, we have a fairly clear distinction between what is a kingdom, what is an empire, what is a country, and what is an empire. The problem is in the real world, obviously, all countries have their own titles for their monarch. Like for Austria, it was Archduke. For Persia, it was Shah. For China, it was whatever we translate as emperor. And sometimes there's a separate title for king, and sometimes there isn't. Like there's Raja, then there's Maharaja. And it varies very wildly by country. And some countries, particularly those that are descended in some way from the Roman Empire, tend to be more eager to take the title of emperor to show that they're kind of the successor to Rome. So what we get in the world is kingdoms that are called empires and empires that are called kingdoms. Like an example of this is Japan, which I would consider a kingdom. It's because we'll get into why in a minute, but it's called an empire and it has an emperor. Whereas England, despite controlling such a large portion of the world, wasn't really called an empire until Queen Victoria got the title Empress of India. I mean, the United Kingdom is kind of an empire, I'd argue more than Japan is, but it's not called that. Whereas you had like the Empire of Serbia, which was just Serbia basically, or there's the Empire of Bulgaria, which is just Bulgaria, which isn't an empire in the same way the Byzantine Empire is. But it's all very confusing. And there's a thing called title inflation, which happens in the corporate world as well as the monarchical world. Because ultimately, there's not, if you're the leader of a sovereign country, there's nothing to stop you from giving yourself whatever title you want. And we saw this with Idi Amin, who called himself like the last king of Scotland. And Mobutu, I think his title was something like, he who fire rains down on those who say his name, etc. Leaders of sovereign states can give them whatever title they want. There's no one who really can say no to them. People can refuse to acknowledge it, but if you're somebody looking back historically at something, it can get confusing. Like the Tsar of Russia is an emperor, but the Tsar of Bulgaria is not an emperor, even though they have kind of the same title. I understand there's subsequent titles, but when we say talk about it colloquially, we say the Tsar of Bulgaria and the Tsar of Russia. And one is an empire and the other isn't. And we call it the Kingdom of Bulgaria, but it's led by a Tsar, but it's the Empire of Russia, but it's led by a Tsar. So my point is, if we're that how kingdoms describe themselves and how heads of state give their title doesn't really determine whether it's an empire or a kingdom. So now that I've gotten you confused, let's talk about what the difference is between the two of them. Now, as with all political terms, there's not a clear line between the two. As with most kind of social sciences or psychology or that sort of thing, basically categories are a heuristic to try to incorporate a whole bunch of different ideas together. So like when you say democracy, for instance, when a country is a democracy and when it's not a democracy is incredibly subjective. Like technically, like it depends how you define it. Is Russia a democracy? Even though the elections are rigged, United Russia would still probably win. But the idea behind the term democracy is it does conjure up a variety of ideas: rule of law, popular sovereignty, representation, non-hereditary rule, the ability to remove politicians through the ballot box, peaceful transition of power. It conjures up all of these ideas, and whether or not a democracy has them or not, the concept of it at least does have meaning when we're trying to communicate ideas. So there's not necessarily a hard distinction between democracy and authoritarianism or fascism and conservatism or something, or liberalism and socialism. But they are bundles of ideas that are useful when we're trying to have discussions about things in a bigger sense. So, as with that, there is a difference between a kingdom and an empire, but it's not 100% obvious. So, basically, a kingdom is one, for lack of a better term, nation or one country. It's the rulership of one people or a group of very closely related peoples. Examples of this would be Scotland, England, Portugal, France, Poland, Greece. These are kind of like the base unit. There's not really a logical reason to divide Greece up anymore, to divide Portugal up anymore, or divide England up anymore. There are regional identities within it, but there is a strong sense of identity, and this is not just something modern, but the concept of Greece being Greece, Portugal being Portugal, England being England, go back a long ways. Or like Morocco or Saudi Arabia or Yemen or Oman. These are kind of stable sovereign units. Now, on the other hand, you have empires, and an empire is where a monarch rules a group of countries. Generally, a group of different ethnic groups, of different territorial units, etc. But they are all under one ruler. And there's a lot of ways that this can happen. This can be through personal union, like the United Kingdom or Spain. This can be where one part of the empire conquers all of the others and then forces it together, which is what happened with Italy and Germany. Or it can be something that just kind of evolves over time and it just becomes an empire like Austro-Hungary. There's lots of different ways that one of them can form, and they aren't necessarily called an empire. But I guess kind of from a political science perspective, I would say the UK is. It may not be quite as much anymore. There's also a distinction based on size and prestige. Generally speaking, the larger a country is and the more powerful it is, the more likely it is to be called an empire. My issue with Japan is it is a sovereign group of islands that has one identity. The reason it's called an empire is, in my opinion, largely because they're trying to claim equality to China. And China is an empire because it's huge and it has a whole bunch of different groups within it. And it's very spread out, etc. Like I said, it's not an exact distinction, but if you think about it, it does kind of make sense. So why have I rambled about this for all this time? It's because Westeros is an empire. The seven kingdoms are all basically kingdoms ruled over by kings who answer, at least theoretically, to an emperor, who is just the king of Westeros or the Iron Throne. So prior to Westeros being formed, there was seven kingdoms, or rather, there wasn't exactly seven kingdoms, because the Riverlands were part of the Iron Isles at the time, and the Crownlands were divided between the between the Riverlands, the Reach, and the Stormlands. Also, Dorne was not part of the Seven Kingdoms as Aegon formed it. But they existed in different places. So you had more powerful kings like the King of the Rock, the King of Mountain Vale, the King of the Iron Islands, the King of the North, the King of the Stormlands, and the Prince of Dorne. So all these places had monarchs, but then there was also lesser monarchs who would rule over, I think, Duskendale and Rosby and some of the places in the Crown Lands. They had the title king, but obviously they weren't kings in the same sense. They didn't control nearly as large a territory, and they weren't regarded as being diplomatically equal to the kings of the larger countries. So when Aegon came and he conquered the various parts of Westeros, the feudal structure within them was not changed basically at all. All that really happened was the Lannisters went from being kings of the Rock to Lord Paramount of the Rock, which is their official title. So a Lord Paramount, as the name suggests, is just the highest lord in an area. They don't answer to anyone but the Iron Throne, and they are the ultimate authority over everyone within the region. So the thing that gets kind of confusing is The various lords of Westeros who are not Lord Paramounts are not sworn to the throne directly, aside from the houses in the Crown Lands, of course. They're sworn to the house in question. Like, so in, for instance, the Westerlings, the Cleganes, the Tarbecks, well, prior to them being exterminated, they all swear fealty to the Lannisters of Casterly Rock, and they're kind of accountable to them rather than the Iron Throne directly. So to say like they are vassals of the Iron Throne is kind of inaccurate. And then kind of within these sub lords, you have greater and lesser lords. So for example, the Manderleys of White Harbor are subject to the Starks, but they also have a variety of vassals underneath them. The fact that the Manderleys have a large number of knights, many of whom are landed, implies that they have houses sworn to them. Now, what kind of gets confusing is there's not really an official title difference within Westeros. Like in real life, you'd have Count or Duke or Viscount or Marquis or some kind of higher title of nobility that has a whole bunch of just petty lords sworn to them. So, like, you'll have the case where, like, House Forrester, if I can refer to the Telltale games, are lords, but they're subject, I believe, to House Glover, and then they have another knightly house beneath them. So, knights are obviously theoretically a bit lower than lords, but not always. The Cleganes pretty clearly have more land and wealth than Littlefinger does. Littlefinger's a lord, but he only has like 24 people under his rule at the Fingers, or the part of the Fingers that he controls, Baelish Keep, which is one of the smallest fiefs in the entire in all of Westeros. So like I said, it's confusing because Wyman Manderley and the Hightowers are both called lords, but they're two of the most powerful lords in the Seven Kingdoms. And they have vassals underneath them who have the same title as them. So it gets very confusing. And then you have various kind of carve-outed exemptions. Like the Lord Paramount of the Iron Islands is called Lord Reaper of Pike, and Dorne is ruled by the Prince of Dorne. So it gets very confusing. The Game of Thrones mod, basically, which I think does the best job of dealing with this, has the Iron Throne, which is an emperor level position, even though it's called a king. Lord Paramount, which is a king level position, even though it's called Lord Paramount. High Lord, which is their equivalent of Duke, which is the greater lords. I was going to say greater lesser lords, but the greater lords, not the greatest lords. So the Manderleys, the Boltons, the Karstarks, the Rains, the Hightowers, etc. And then underneath them you have just lords, which I know fewer of, but like Foresters would be some of them. The Valerians, the Craycalls, etc. And then under them you'd have landed knights, and landed knights might only have like a tower house and a village underneath them. But it gets very confusing. So that's kind of my attempt to explain how it's set up politically in terms of the various levels of government. So let's move on to how it functions, or rather how it doesn't function. So I think the other core thing to understand about Westeros is that Westeros only functions so long as the kings of the who rule from the Iron Throne have dragons. So what do I mean by this? Aegon the Conqueror invaded Westeros with a very small army. Even when he went to the later battles of his campaign in the Westerlands and the Reach, he was far outnumbered. All he really had at the beginning was his direct vassals like the Valerians and I think the Craycalls, whatever the other Valerian descended family is. All he had was them when he went up against the Lords of the Crown Lands. And then he gradually got momentum and he got more and more people as he invaded the Stormlands and the Riverlands. But he was always outnumbered, often by often his opponents would have many times the number of soldiers as him. He would just win because he had dragons, and dragons trump everything. When Aegon the Conqueror defeated all the kingdoms, he didn't change anything about them, really. True, they had to pay taxes to the central government, and later kings like Jaehaerys would somewhat centralize things by introducing a universal code of laws and building roads. But by and large, the Lords Paramount still enjoyed absolute sovereignty over their territories. And the only way that the king could really get them to do what they wanted is to threaten them with dragons. And if you read Fire and Blood, this is very common. The Targaryen kings don't have a bureaucracy really, or anything like that to try to, or a royal army to go in and pressure the kingdoms into doing what they want them to do. They just have to threaten to go in and blow everything up with dragons to get what they want, or they have to try to use soft power by playing lords off against each other or offering concessions, etc. So their actual ability was entirely dependent upon dragons. And I mean, just looking at this map, the Crownlands are not very big. It's, I think, the smallest constituent region of Westeros. I'm not sure if it's the smallest region by population. I think Dorne is, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Crownlands had less population. And when Aegon conquered the Seven Kingdoms, all he took for himself to be directly ruled by him is the Crownlands, which was just never part of any existent large kingdom. The issue, though, is that the Crownlands aren't particularly large, and they themselves are very decentralized. And the lords there aren't always completely reliable. So while they can raise a decent-sized army from the Crownlands, it's not really big enough to fight any of the component parts of Westeros. It's not big enough to fight the Reach, come close to fighting the Reach, or the Riverlands, or the Vale, or the Stormlands. They can raise an army, but all it can really do is be a complement to the armies of the existing lords. And we could see this during Robert's Rebellion, where they actually had a decent sized army, but it wasn't as big from the Crown. Like, they got a bunch of reinforcements from the Reach and Dorne, which kind of gave them a slight numerical advantage. And then a number of houses sided with the Targaryens, but the Crownlands themselves are not really comparable to any of the other Seven Kingdoms. So if at any point in time one of the Seven Kingdoms decides to tell the king no, the only way they really had to enforce their will was dragons. And once the dragons were gone, the Iron Throne kind of became a toothless wolf. They became a tiger without claws because they didn't really have any means of forcing obedience anymore. And so that's kind of, in my view, part of why the Targaryen monarchy declined so much after the Dance of the Dragons, is all they're left with was their nominal authority as leader of the Iron Throne, the ability to play off the different factions against each other, the wealth they get from controlling national tax revenue, and whatever levies they can raise within the Crownlands. So, like, when the vassals decide that they don't want to obey anymore, it's not too difficult for them to just march on the Crownlands and overthrow it. I mean, that's basically what happened during Robert's Rebellion. And as we can see later on, the Crownlands can't really do that much to fight off Stannis. And the army that the Lannisters wind up using in the campaign against Robb Stark and Riverrun is almost entirely composed of Lannister soldiers and mercenaries. The Crownlands is very limited in power. Some of the wealthiest houses within Westeros, such as the Valerians, are within the Crownlands, but overall it's very weak contrasted to the rest of the country. So like I said, they have to play off different lords' ambitions against each other, make marriage alliances like the Lannisters did with the Reach. The goal is to try to get enough of the kingdoms loyal to them or on their side that the implicit threat is enough to put the others in line. Like in the aftermath of the War of the Five Kings, in the books at least, the Lannisters control the Westerlands, the Reach, the Crownlands, about half of the Stormlands, and the most of the Riverlands. So they have a majority of the realm's money and military power. So they can basically enforce their will on the rest of the country, at least theoretically. Part of the problem, though, is also most of the Seven Kingdoms are very defensible, with the exception of the Riverlands. The Vale is very easy to defend. Dorne is very easy to defend. To a certain extent, the Stormlands are, and the Westerlands are. Most of them have pretty natural borders, and to kind of invade to enforce your will is a very difficult prospect. So the question is, it's important to keep in mind within the context of the story, after the Targaryen monarchy fell, it didn't last particularly long in meta historical terms. Like, it collapsed, what, like 16 years after Ares II died. You had the Vale basically becoming de facto independent, the North and the Riverlands declaring themselves to be an independent kingdom, Dorne basically breaking away, Stannis declaring himself to be king of the Iron Throne, etc. The Iron Islands declaring themselves to be independent once again. And you just had the whole thing completely collapse in a way that it hadn't for pretty much the entire time that the Targaryens had been in power. With the exception of Dorne, I don't recall there really being that much of a secession movement in the various parts of the Seven Kingdoms. Even after they lost dragons, there's a lot of institutional inertia. And I think a lot of the kingdoms realized that if they got rid of the Targaryen, it was better to have a weak Targaryen monarchy that prevented cataclysmic warfare and the squabbling that had accompanied the Seven Kingdoms prior to Aegon conquering, than to just throw the Targaryens out and to just start the whole cycle anew. Because, like I said, most of them have defensible borders. So, like, between the Westerlands and the Reach, it would just be a slugfest. And I doubt any side could really gain a meaningful advantage. Same thing with the Vale, because it's very difficult to attack. The North is a fortress. So no one, I think, really wanted to go back to that situation. But I think to a certain extent it shows how weak it was beyond that. As once the Targaryens fell in kind of institutional inertia, just stopped being a thing. It didn't last particularly long. So, like, one of the big issues with it is that there's a lot of different cultures within the Seven Kingdoms. Even if you can say that, broadly speaking, the middle part of the country, the Stormlands, the Reach, Westerlands, the Riverlands, Crownlands, and the Vale, are all Andal culture and all have the faith of the Seven, which is something that kind of that they had in common that united them. And once again, you can see this in Fire and Blood with the Faith Militant Uprising. They receive support from all of the southern kingdoms, with the except, well, Dorne's not part of it at that time, and that's kind of something to tie them together. But even though the Iron Throne is technically faith of the Seven, and even though that's technically the faith of the realm, etc., you also have the issue where you have large populations in the Iron Isles and the North who don't accept the faith of the Seven. So religion can't really be a basis to hold the realm together. And that was kind of an issue they had over time. If they had succeeded in converting the Iron Isles, that probably would have gone a long way towards unity of the realm. But you have a realm that's not held together by any kind of really, at least most of it, religion or culture or even really ethnicity. Like I said, it would make more sense for the Middle Kingdoms to be united and for the North, Dorne, and the Iron Isles to be independent. But just kind of the way things are set up, nobody really wants that to happen in terms of those who are trying to take the throne. Stannis doesn't want that to happen. Renly doesn't. The Lannisters aren't willing to accept it, etc. And so you have this kind of artificial state that was only held together by dragons. And the paper tiger of sorts that gave the Targaryens just kind of falling apart. So I hope that kind of made sense. I know I was a little abstract on this one. I know I kind of went into a lot of kind of obscure political science. But hopefully you enjoyed the video. Hopefully you learned something from it, and more to come.